What if one of the most enduring mysteries of the ancient world began not on the earth, but in the sky above it? Imagine standing at the edge of a silent desert overlooking the Dead Sea as dusk settles across the horizon. The air is heavy with salt. Jagged cliffs cast long shadows across a landscape that seems older than memory itself. Somewhere beyond those barren ridges, according to one of the most famous accounts in ancient literature, entire cities vanished in a single moment. Not after years of war, not after a slow decline. In an instant, fire fell, the ground trembled, the sky became a source of terror. Yet the deeper we investigate the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the more unsettling the mystery becomes. Question: what actually happened here? The historical record shows that ancient writers remembered a catastrophe so extraordinary that they described it as fire and sulfur descending from heaven. But were they witnessing a supernatural judgment, a natural disaster, or something that existed between those categories in the ancient imagination? The evidence suggests that the region surrounding the Dead Sea has experienced earthquakes, geological upheaval, and violent environmental events throughout its history. Some scholars argue that these memories may preserve traces of a real catastrophe. Others remain unconvinced, noting that theological texts are not archaeological reports. The difficulty with every explanation is that the story refuses to fit neatly into a single category. The text remembers destruction. The landscape remembers destruction. Yet neither tells us exactly what fell from the sky. This raises a deeper question. Are we investigating a historical event, a theological warning, or the memory of a disaster so overwhelming that ancient witnesses could only describe it using the language of heaven itself? Tonight, we begin not with an answer, but with a doorway. Beyond it lies a ruined city, a darkened sky, and a mystery that has haunted historians, theologians, and archaeologists for thousands of years. To understand the mystery of Sodom and Gomorrah, we must leave the ruins behind and return to the world that existed before the sky became a source of fear. Imagine the southern Levant during the Bronze Age. The Dead Sea Basin lies at the heart of a harsh, yet strategically important landscape. Salt cliffs rise above the shoreline. Dry wadis cut through rugged hills. Trade routes connect distant settlements, carrying copper, bitumen, grain, textiles, and stories between kingdoms. Along the fertile margins of this region, fortified towns emerge beside springs and agricultural land, their stone gates opening to merchants, shepherds, and travelers moving across Canaan. The historical record shows that the Dead Sea Basin was not an isolated wilderness. It occupied a crossroads between larger civilizations. To the north and west lay the city-states of Canaan. To the east stretched caravan routes crossing desert plateaus. To the south, mining regions supplied valuable resources sought throughout the ancient Near East. The people who inhabited this landscape lived in a world where geography and theology were inseparable. Mountains, deserts, rivers, and skies were not merely natural features. They were part of a sacred order. The evidence suggests that communities around the Dead Sea were deeply familiar with the unpredictable forces of nature. Earthquakes could reshape valleys. Bitumen occasionally surfaced from the waters. Sulfur deposits existed throughout the region. Fire, smoke, and seismic activity were not abstract concepts, but realities embedded within daily experience. This raises an important question. When ancient writers later described destruction falling from heaven, were they interpreting an event through a theological lens already shaped by the landscape itself? Some scholars argue that the geography of the Dead Sea played a significant role in the formation of the tradition. Others remain unconvinced, warning against drawing direct conclusions from environmental conditions alone. The difficulty with both positions is that the ancient world did not separate nature from meaning in the way later societies often would. For the people who lived here, the land itself seemed to speak. Every cliff, every salt formation, every trembling fault line beneath the earth carried the possibility that unseen forces were at work. It was within this world, where trade, faith, survival, and catastrophe existed side by side, that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah first took shape. Imagine an ancient wall painting preserved beneath centuries of dust, its colors dimmed by time, yet still carrying the memory of a terrifying night. At the center of the image stands a fortified city built from pale limestone and sun-baked mud brick. Towers rise above massive gates. Narrow streets wind between rooftops illuminated by the final glow of evening. For a brief moment, everything appears calm. Then the sky begins to change. Dark clouds gather above the horizon, but they are unlike ordinary storm clouds. Their edges glow with an unnatural crimson light. The heavens seem divided between darkness and fire. Beams of gold and blood-red illumination break through layers of smoke, casting strange shadows across the city walls. High above the settlement, fragments of burning light descend through the sky. Some resemble falling stars. Others appear as streams of molten fire. The ancient artist leaves their true nature deliberately uncertain. The eye is drawn downward toward the city gate, where figures stand frozen in silence, gazing upward. Their faces reveal not panic but disbelief, as if they are witnessing something beyond ordinary experience. Beyond the city walls stretches the Dead Sea Basin, rendered in dark mineral blues and silver-gray tones. Salt cliffs shimmer beneath flashes of fiery light. Columns of smoke rise from the earth itself, merging with the burning heavens until sky and land become indistinguishable. Near the edge of the composition stands a solitary pillar of salt, illuminated by a narrow shaft of light. It appears less like a human figure than a monument to memory itself. The symbolism is unmistakable. Heaven descends toward earth. Earth answers with fire and smoke. The boundary between the two collapses. Some scholars argue that such imagery reflects theological memory rather than eyewitness observation. Others suggest it may preserve echoes of a real catastrophe interpreted through sacred language. The difficulty with choosing only one explanation is that the image seems to operate on both levels simultaneously. It depicts destruction, but also meaning. The longer one studies the scene, the more it feels like a visual riddle left behind by a civilization struggling to describe an event so extraordinary that ordinary language could no longer contain it. The deeper we investigate Sodom and Gomorrah, the more the story transforms from a tale of destruction into a conflict between competing interpretations of the past. The first conflict concerns location. Question: where were these cities actually located? The historical record preserves the names, but not their precise coordinates. Some scholars argue that the cities were situated near the southern basin of the Dead Sea, pointing to archaeological sites such as Bab Edra and Nemera, where evidence of destruction and abandonment has been uncovered. Others remain unconvinced, suggesting that sites farther north, particularly Tal El Hammam, better fit certain geographical descriptions and exhibit signs of sudden catastrophe. The difficulty with both positions is that no inscription has yet been discovered identifying any site as Sodom or Gomorrah. Archaeology provides clues, but not certainty. A second conflict emerges between geology and theology. The Dead Sea region sits within one of the most active fault systems in the ancient Near East. Earthquakes, ground ruptures, gas releases, and fires are all plausible components of a large-scale natural disaster. The evidence suggests that ancient populations living in the region would have experienced such events firsthand. Interpretation: perhaps the biblical account preserves a cultural memory of a catastrophic geological event. Counterargument: the Genesis narrative is structured as a theological judgment story rather than a geological report. Some scholars argue that reducing the account to natural causes risks overlooking its literary and religious purpose. Reassessment: both perspectives recognize destruction, but explain its meaning differently. A third conflict involves the nature of the event itself. Was the catastrophe gradual or instantaneous? Some researchers point to evidence of intense heat at certain archaeological sites, leading to hypotheses involving cosmic airbursts or meteor-related phenomena. Others remain skeptical, arguing that the available evidence does not yet justify such dramatic conclusions. Historical fact: ancient texts remember fire from heaven. Archaeological evidence: some sites preserve traces of extreme destruction. Scholarly interpretation: multiple mechanisms have been proposed. Narrative reflection: every explanation solves part of the puzzle while leaving another piece unexplained. This raises a deeper question. Are we searching for the city that inspired the story, or are we searching for the event that inspired the memory? The two may not necessarily be the same thing. Yet the debate remains open, and it is within that uncertainty that the mystery continues to live. When we move beyond the familiar account in Genesis, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah begins to unfold through a network of lesser-known texts, ancient commentaries, and traditions that attempted to preserve fragments of memory long after the cities themselves had vanished. Question: how did later generations understand the catastrophe? The historical record shows that the destruction of Sodom became one of the most enduring symbols in Jewish and early Mediterranean literature. Yet many of these sources contain details absent from the biblical narrative itself. One of the most important witnesses is the Jewish historian Josephus. Writing in the 1st century, he describes the region surrounding the Dead Sea as a landscape still bearing visible traces of the ancient judgment. According to his account, visitors could observe remnants associated with the destroyed cities, and he refers to strange fruits that appeared beautiful from a distance but collapsed into ash when touched. Some scholars argue that this description reflects local traditions connected to mineral deposits and unusual environmental conditions around the Dead Sea. Others remain unconvinced, noting that Josephus often blended historical reporting with inherited folklore. The difficulty with dismissing his testimony entirely is that it demonstrates how strongly the memory of the catastrophe remained attached to the landscape centuries later. Additional traditions emerge in Second Temple literature. Here, Sodom increasingly becomes more than a city. It becomes an archetype of corruption, arrogance, and social disorder. Interpretation: later writers transformed a historical memory into a theological symbol. Counterargument: some scholars suggest that these developments may preserve independent traditions now lost to us. Reassessment: both possibilities remain viable because the original event itself remains uncertain. Another intriguing detail appears in ancient geographical traditions that describe regions near the Dead Sea as cursed or permanently altered by an extraordinary disaster. The strongest evidence comes not from any single text, but from the persistence of the theme across centuries. Historical fact: numerous ancient writers remembered a destroyed city near the Dead Sea. Archaeological evidence: the region contains unusual geological and environmental features. Scholarly interpretation: these traditions may represent a mixture of memory, symbolism, and observation. Narrative reflection: the hidden texts reveal something remarkable. Long after the flames had faded, whether literal or symbolic, the need to explain what happened remained alive. The cities disappeared. The questions survived. And it is those surviving questions that continue to guide our investigation today. To understand why the story of Sodom and Gomorrah endured for millennia, we must look beyond the question of what happened and examine the symbols through which ancient people interpreted what happened. In the ancient world, catastrophe was rarely viewed as a meaningless event. It was read as a message. Question: why do the narrative's most memorable images involve fire, sulfur, salt, and the sky? The evidence suggests that each symbol carried layers of meaning already familiar to ancient audiences. Consider fire. Historical fact: fire was one of the most feared forces in Bronze Age settlements built largely from mud brick, timber, and organic materials. Yet in ancient literature, fire often signified more than destruction. It represented purification, transformation, and the visible manifestation of power beyond human control. Interpretation: when ancient texts describe fire descending from heaven, they are not merely describing heat. They are describing a force that appears to originate from outside the ordinary world. Sulfur carries a similar complexity. The Dead Sea region contains natural sulfur deposits, making the image geographically plausible. Archaeological evidence: sulfur and bitumen were known throughout the region. Scholarly interpretation: these materials may have contributed to the imagery preserved in the tradition. Yet sulfur also became a literary symbol of corruption, decay, and irreversible ruin. The sky itself may be the most important symbol of all. In the religious imagination of the ancient Near East, the heavens represented cosmic order. Rain, sunlight, and seasonal stability descended from above. Therefore, when destruction falls from the sky, the symbolism is profound. The source of life becomes the source of judgment. This raises a deeper question. Was the story describing a physical event, or was it expressing the collapse of an entire moral and cosmic order? The final symbol is salt. The region surrounding the Dead Sea is saturated with it. Yet salt occupies a paradoxical place in ancient thought. It preserves life by preventing decay, but excessive salt renders land barren. Narrative reflection. The pillar of salt stands between memory and loss, preservation and destruction. The strongest evidence suggests that these symbols emerged from a real landscape familiar to ancient observers. Yet their power comes from something deeper. Fire, sulfur, sky, and salt transformed a regional catastrophe into a universal language through which ancient people explored judgment, fragility, memory, and the terrifying possibility that the order of the world itself could suddenly be overturned. Among all the theories proposed to explain the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, few have generated as much fascination and controversy as the possibility that something extraordinary entered the atmosphere above the Dead Sea region. Question: what if the ancient description of fire falling from heaven was not purely symbolic language, but a distant memory of a catastrophic celestial event? This interpretation remained largely outside mainstream discussion for centuries, yet recent debates have brought it back into scholarly conversation. The evidence begins with a simple observation. Ancient texts repeatedly emphasize destruction coming from above. Fire, sulfur, a sudden and overwhelming catastrophe descending from the sky. Some researchers have suggested that these descriptions bear a striking resemblance to the effects of a meteor airburst, a phenomenon in which a cosmic object explodes in the atmosphere before reaching the ground. Such an event can generate intense heat, shockwaves, fires, and widespread devastation across a large area. Interpretation: perhaps ancient witnesses experienced an event so extraordinary that they described it using theological language available to them. Some scholars argue that certain archaeological findings, including evidence of extreme temperatures at sites such as Tal el-Hammam, may be consistent with this possibility. The strongest evidence comes from materials reportedly exposed to heat levels difficult to explain through ordinary urban fires alone. Yet the debate remains open. Counterargument: many researchers remain skeptical. The difficulty with the airburst interpretation is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Critics argue that destruction layers can result from multiple causes, including warfare, earthquakes, accidental fires, or combinations of environmental factors. Others question whether the archaeological data can support the certainty sometimes claimed by proponents of the theory. Reassessment: the meteor hypothesis remains intriguing precisely because it attempts to connect textual memory, environmental catastrophe, and physical evidence within a single framework. But it does not resolve every problem. Historical fact: ancient texts describe destruction from heaven. Archaeological evidence: some sites preserve signs of unusual devastation. Scholarly interpretation: a celestial event remains one possible explanation among several competing models. Narrative reflection: perhaps what makes this interpretation so compelling is not merely the possibility that something fell from the sky. It is the unsettling realization that ancient people may have witnessed a natural event so terrifying, so far beyond ordinary experience, that it became inseparable from the language of divine judgment. Whether that interpretation is correct remains uncertain, but it reminds us that the boundary between cosmic disaster and sacred memory may be far thinner than we often imagine. At this point in our investigation, we encounter a crossroads where two very different explanations stand before us. Both attempt to account for the same evidence. Both possess strengths. Both face significant challenges. Question: what really happened to Sodom and Gomorrah? The first theory may be called the historical catastrophe model. The evidence supporting this view begins with geography. The Dead Sea Basin is a region marked by seismic instability, natural bitumen deposits, sulfur, and evidence of past environmental disasters. Archaeological investigations at several sites reveal episodes of sudden destruction. Some scholars argue that the biblical account preserves a cultural memory of a real catastrophe, later expressed through religious language. According to this interpretation, ancient witnesses observed an extraordinary event, perhaps an earthquake, a massive fire, a gas ignition, or even a cosmic airburst, and described it as fire from heaven. The strength of this theory is that it connects text, landscape, and archaeology. The difficulty is that no archaeological discovery has conclusively identified Sodom itself or demonstrated exactly which event inspired the narrative. The second theory may be called the theological narrative model. Historical fact: Ancient Near Eastern literature often used dramatic imagery to communicate moral and theological truths. Some scholars argue that Genesis was never intended to function as a geological report. Instead, the destruction narrative serves as a theological reflection on justice, corruption, and the fragility of civilization. Interpretation: the language of fire and sulfur expresses meaning rather than mechanism. The strength of this approach is that it respects the literary structure and theological purpose of the text. Counterargument: critics argue that it risks overlooking possible historical memories preserved within the tradition. Reassessment: perhaps the debate itself reveals a false choice. Some scholars suggest a third possibility. A real catastrophe may have occurred, while later generations interpreted that catastrophe through theological reflection. In this model, history and meaning are not competitors, but partners. Archaeological evidence may explain what happened. Theology may explain what the event meant to those who remembered it. My reading of the evidence is that neither side fully eliminates the other. The strongest explanations often emerge where history, memory, and interpretation intersect. Yet the debate remains open. If an ancient city truly vanished in a sudden disaster, how much of the story reflects the event itself, and how much reflects the way human beings struggled to understand it afterward? When we arrive at the archaeological evidence, the atmosphere of the investigation changes. The texts begin to fall silent, and the landscape itself becomes our witness. Question: can archaeology identify the cities remembered as Sodom and Gomorrah? The answer is more complicated than many expect. Historical fact: no excavation has yet uncovered an inscription stating, "This was Sodom," or "This was Gomorrah." Archaeological evidence must therefore be interpreted through geography, chronology, destruction layers, and cultural context. One of the earliest candidates is Bab Edhrah, located near the southeastern Dead Sea. Excavations revealed a Bronze Age settlement that experienced destruction and eventual abandonment. Nearby sites, such as Nemera, display similar patterns. Some scholars argue that these locations fit long-standing traditions placing the cities in the southern basin. The strength of this interpretation lies in its geographical consistency. The difficulty is that the chronology and textual details remain debated. A second and more controversial candidate is Tal el Hammam, situated northeast of the Dead Sea. Archaeological investigations there have revealed evidence of a major destruction event and unusually intense heat. Some researchers suggest that this site may preserve traces of a catastrophic airburst similar to a cosmic explosion in the atmosphere. Interpretation: perhaps this was the historical event that inspired memories of fire from heaven. Counterargument: many scholars remain unconvinced, arguing that identification with Sodom is far from certain and that alternative explanations for the destruction remain possible. Reassessment: the evidence is intriguing but not definitive. Beyond settlements, the Dead Sea itself preserves echoes of the tradition. Ancient travelers frequently described the region as strange, lifeless, and marked by visible geological scars. Sulfur deposits, bitumen formations, salt cliffs, and seismic activity contributed to an environment unlike most of the ancient world. The archaeological record cannot fully answer whether these features inspired the story or simply reinforced it after the fact. This raises a deeper question. Are we uncovering the remains of a specific city, or are we uncovering the environmental memory that allowed the tradition to endure? Narrative reflection: archaeology rarely delivers perfect certainty. Instead, it reveals fragments, a burned wall, a collapsed structure, a layer of ash, a ruined settlement. Taken alone, each fragment is incomplete. Taken together, they suggest that the memory of destruction preserved in ancient texts did not emerge from an empty landscape. Something happened here. What that something was remains one of the most fascinating unresolved questions in biblical archaeology. To an ancient reader, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was never merely a question of how a city was destroyed. It was a question of what the destruction meant. This distinction is essential if we wish to understand the theological significance of the story within its original worldview. Question: why does the narrative describe catastrophe as descending from heaven? The historical record shows that ancient Near Eastern societies understood the cosmos as a structured and meaningful order. Heaven, earth, and the underworld were not separate realms operating independently. They formed a connected reality in which human actions, divine authority, and natural events existed within the same framework. When order prevailed, the world functioned as intended. When disorder increased, catastrophe often followed. Interpretation: the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah served as a dramatic example of this principle. The story presents a world in which social corruption, injustice, and moral collapse are not isolated human problems. They become disruptions of cosmic order itself. Some scholars argue that the narrative reflects an ancient conviction that societies ultimately stand within a larger moral structure. Others remain cautious, noting that different biblical texts emphasize different aspects of Sodom's wrongdoing, including arrogance, neglect of the vulnerable, and violations of hospitality. The difficulty with reducing the story to a single offense is that the ancient authors appear concerned with a broader pattern of disorder. Historical fact: hospitality occupied a sacred role throughout the ancient Near East, especially in harsh desert environments where survival often depended upon the protection of strangers. Archaeological evidence cannot measure moral behavior, but it can illuminate the social world in which such values developed. Reassessment: the theological message emerges not from one action, but from the perceived breakdown of relationships that sustained communal life. This raises a deeper question. Why does the story place such emphasis on heaven as the source of judgment? In ancient thought, the sky represented stability. Rain came from above. Light came from above. Seasons followed patterns established above. Therefore, when destruction falls from heaven, the symbolism is profound. The very source of order becomes the instrument through which disorder is confronted. Narrative reflection: whether ancient readers interpreted the event as historical, symbolic, or both, the theological significance remained the same. The story reminded them that civilizations are not sustained by walls, wealth, or military strength alone. They survive because they remain aligned with the order they believe governs the world. Once that order collapses, even the strongest city can become a memory buried beneath dust, salt, and silence. As our investigation moves beyond ruined cities and competing theories, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah begins to reveal a deeper concern, one that extends far beyond a single catastrophe. The ancient texts preserve the memory of destruction, but beneath that memory lies a question about the human condition itself. Why do civilizations remember disasters long after they have forgotten ordinary days? The historical record shows that countless settlements rose and fell across the ancient Near East. Most disappeared without leaving a lasting place in cultural memory. Yet certain catastrophes survived. Their stories endured for generations, copied by scribes, repeated by travelers, and woven into sacred traditions. The evidence suggests that such events became more than historical occurrences. They became mirrors through which people examined their own existence. Question: what does the destruction of a city reveal about those who remember it? In the ancient world, cities represented permanence. Walls, gates, temples, and marketplaces embodied the hope that human effort could create order amid uncertainty. When a city vanished suddenly, that confidence was shaken. Interpretation: the story of Sodom and Gomorrah became a meditation on fragility. Not merely the fragility of buildings, but the fragility of all human achievements. Counterargument: some scholars argue that the narrative is primarily theological and should not be transformed into a broader philosophical reflection. The difficulty with that objection is that ancient theology and philosophy were rarely separated. Questions about divine order were also questions about human destiny. This raises a deeper question. Why did ancient people repeatedly look toward heaven when confronted with destruction? Perhaps because the limits of human knowledge become most visible during catastrophe. The archaeological record can uncover burned walls. Texts can preserve memories. Traditions can offer interpretations. Yet none can fully explain why some events imprint themselves upon collective memory while others fade into silence. Narrative reflection: the pillar of salt, the burning sky, the ruined city, all function as symbols of a reality ancient people understood well. Human beings inhabit a world they can partially comprehend, but never completely master. The desire to understand disaster is therefore also a desire to understand existence itself. My reading of the evidence is that the enduring power of Sodom and Gomorrah lies not in the certainty of what happened, but in the recognition that every civilization eventually confronts the same mystery: how to find meaning when confronted with forces larger than itself. And it is precisely because that mystery remains unresolved that the story continues to endure. After following the evidence through ancient texts, ruined settlements, geological scars, theological traditions, and centuries of debate, we arrive at the point where every responsible investigation must distinguish between certainty and possibility. Historical fact: ancient sources consistently preserve the memory of a catastrophic destruction associated with Sodom and Gomorrah. Archaeological evidence: the Dead Sea region contains settlements that experienced sudden devastation, environmental instability, seismic activity, and episodes of extreme destruction. Scholarly interpretation: multiple explanations remain under active discussion, including earthquake-related disasters, fire events fueled by natural resources, atmospheric explosions, and theological narratives built upon historical memory. Yet none of these explanations fully closes the case. Question: what is the strongest conclusion the evidence allows us to reach? The evidence suggests that the story did not emerge from an empty landscape. Ancient writers were preserving a memory of destruction powerful enough to survive across generations. The strongest evidence comes from the convergence of text, geography, and cultural memory. Something extraordinary appears to have happened in or around the Dead Sea basin. Counterargument: extraordinary events alone do not automatically identify a specific city, confirm a specific biblical episode, or validate a single interpretation. The archaeological record cannot fully answer whether the catastrophe remembered in Scripture corresponds directly to any particular excavation site. Reassessment: perhaps the search for a single explanation has sometimes obscured the deeper significance of the tradition itself. Throughout this investigation, one pattern has repeatedly emerged. History remembers an event. Theology interprets the event. Memory transforms the event. Over time, these layers become inseparable. The result is a narrative that exists simultaneously as historical memory, theological reflection, and cultural warning. Narrative reflection: the most profound revelation may not concern what fell from the sky. It may concern what survived after it fell. Cities disappeared. Buildings collapsed. Populations scattered. Yet the memory endured. My reading of the evidence is that Sodom and Gomorrah occupy a rare position where catastrophe became meaning. Whether the original event was geological, astronomical, environmental, or some combination of forces, later generations understood it as a moment when the visible world seemed to reveal a deeper order or disorder beneath its surface. Yet the debate remains open. The ruins do not speak with one voice. The texts do not answer every question. And perhaps that uncertainty is not a weakness of the story. Perhaps it is the reason the story survived. For the closer we move toward a final answer, the more we discover that the true mystery is not only what happened to those cities, but how human beings transform disaster into memory, memory into meaning, and meaning into history. And so we return to the shores of the Dead Sea, where our investigation began. The sun is sinking behind the cliffs. The salt-covered ridges glow briefly beneath fading light. The ruins, whether they belong to Sodom, Gomorrah, or some other forgotten settlement, remain silent. The texts remain open. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet perhaps this is precisely where the most important questions begin. Throughout this journey, we have examined ancient manuscripts, archaeological sites, geological theories, theological traditions, and centuries of scholarly debate. Historical fact: a powerful memory of destruction survived in the ancient world. Archaeological evidence: the landscape preserves traces of catastrophe and environmental upheaval. Scholarly interpretation: no single explanation commands universal agreement. Narrative reflection: the mystery endures because each layer of evidence illuminates part of the story while leaving another part in shadow. This raises a deeper question. Why do some disasters become history while others become myth? Why did the memory of these cities survive when countless other ruined settlements disappeared from human consciousness? Some scholars argue that the answer lies in the scale of the catastrophe itself. Others suggest that the enduring power of the story comes from the theological and symbolic meanings attached to it. Yet the debate remains open. Perhaps the most remarkable discovery is not a ruined wall, a burned layer, or a geological fault line. Perhaps it is the realization that ancient people were wrestling with the same problem we encounter throughout this investigation: how to interpret an event that seems larger than ordinary explanation. My reading of the evidence is that Sodom and Gomorrah occupy a unique place where history, memory, theology, and human imagination intersect. Remove any one of those dimensions, and the mystery becomes smaller. Keep them together, and the story remains alive. If you have followed this inquiry from beginning to end, then you have become part of a conversation that extends across centuries of scribes, pilgrims, historians, archaeologists, and seekers of forgotten knowledge. The work remains unfinished. Forgotten scriptures exist within that unfinished space, where evidence is examined carefully, assumptions are questioned, and ancient mysteries are allowed to remain genuinely mysterious. And so we leave the Dead Sea with one final question, one that scholars still debate, and that the archaeological record may never fully resolve. If a catastrophe truly devastated a city near these waters, did later generations transform history into sacred memory? Or was sacred memory itself the only way to preserve a truth too extraordinary for ordinary language to contain?